But this story is truly an incredible story. Because God takes him and tells him to go marry a prostitute. Now keep in mind, this story would have been strong enough if it were an allegory, if it were a metaphor. Just think about the man that was told to go marry a prostitute. Once upon a time, there was a man that God told to go marry a prostitute. And even if it's a made-up story, it's an incredible story. But this is not an allegory. It really happened. And he marries a prostitute, and he has 3 children by her. And so you know that this takes place over several years. This is not something that's done on a weekend or something that's done in a few months. There are several years that make up this marriage, possibly decades or more. And there are several times, if you read through the Scripture, where she leaves him. She just ups and leaves. And there he is with his children. And his wife, the prostitute, is left. And they hear rumors, and she's back plying her old trade. If you try to update this story, it might be somebody that really has a severe drug problem. And they try to come out of it, and they try to straighten their life up. And they do okay for a year or two. And then they're back on the drugs, and they leave home, and they're back in that lifestyle, and they're practicing prostitution again. He goes and takes her, finds her, brings her home. And he does this several times. And it even gets to the point to where she becomes an actual slave. And he buys her out of slavery. He buys his own wife out of slavery to bring her home for his children. And we look at this and we think, man, that would have been so tough to do. Oh, Hosea, I just don't know if I could have done that. I don't know if I could have forgiven her that many times. Hosea was what a man he was. And this is trying to show us how God forgives us. But what we need to understand, there are lessons to be learned about Hosea. But the real lesson to be learned from this story is that you are Gomer. The story is not told so how we could look at Hosea and say, I don't know if I could have forgiven somebody that did something like that. Well, guess what? You and you and you and me, we are Gomer. We are the prostitute. We are the one that turns our back on God over and over and over. And because of His love, He seeks us out, buys us out of slavery, brings us home, and yet here we go again. You will never know all the lessons to be learned unless you understand that when you read literature, whether it's Bible, whether it is fiction, whether it is fact, you must be willing and able to put yourself in the place of the antagonist. You see, we like to identify with the protagonist. We like to identify with the hero. But you will never learn all the lessons to be learned unless you identify yourself as the villain. We read the story of Cain and Abel. And we feel sorry for Cain, and we feel sorry for Adam, and we feel sorry for Eve. But you will never get everything you need to get out of that story unless you realize you are Cain. Well, you say, well, I would never murder my brother. Yeah, you would. You have the capacity to do everything that Cain did to his brother. And maybe you have never physically killed your brother, but let me ask you a question. Have you ever murdered a relationship? Have you ever murdered somebody's reputation through gossip? There are a lot of ways to murder someone. Have you ever murdered some young person's dreams and goals and ambitions because of something you have said? We read the story of Joseph, and there are so many lessons. I just have completed a series on Joseph, and there are so many lessons to learn from Joseph. But do you understand that we also are Joseph's brothers? That we also have the capacity within us to be so caught up with anger and jealousy and envy that we will sell our own flesh and blood? And there are probably times when we have done that mentally, if not physically. We look at the story of David, and there are so many wonderful lessons to be learned from David. But have you ever put yourself in the place of his son Absalom? We read that story, and David had a son that rebelled against him. He had a son that went to war against his father. And we say, oh, poor David. His son fought against him. His son embarrassed him. His son humiliated him. His son started a civil war against him. And we feel sorry because even after Absalom was killed, David said, oh, my son, Absalom, I wish that I had been killed rather than you. And it never occurs to us that we are Absalom. And I cannot tell you the number of young people that have gone to war against their mother or father because of their rebellious spirit. They have destroyed their family. And the only reason it wasn't a civil war is because they were not a prince and their father was not a king. But how many families do you know that have been destroyed by rebellious children that played the part of Absalom, just not on such a large scale? Whether it is Absalom, we read the story of Samson, and we do not understand that we are Delilah. How many relationships have been destroyed for a lot less than Delilah received? How many marriages have been destroyed because of a lot less money than why she betrayed Samson? And you can go down story upon story upon story. And we love to identify with Peter, and we love to identify with Paul, but how many of you have ever identified with Judas? Judas did not hate Jesus. Judas was a follower of Jesus. In fact, when he did what he did, it was a surprise to everyone. Judas just tried to put his will above the will of God. He just tried to put God in a position to where Jesus would have to reveal himself, would have to manifest his glory and his power to save himself. He did not understand that Jesus did not come to save himself. He came to save us. And how many times have we tried to put God in a place and we say, God, my will is this. My will be done, not thy will be done. Until you can stand on the edge of the abyss and look down into the darkness that is your very soul, you will never really comprehend some of the great lessons of life. We go to history and we read World War II. And we look at German Hitler, who took power in what could arguably be the most Christian nation in Europe in the 1930s. The home of Martin Luther. And we wonder, would we have bowed the knee to Hitler? Would we have put out the hand and made the salute, "Hail Hitler"? And I can tell you from what I have observed from most people in the past year and a half, we would have. As most people have bowed the knee to our own government. We would have bowed the knee to Hitler in most cases, but we don't like to think that we would. We look at something like the Holocaust and we identify with those poor Jews that were taken and put in a gas chamber. And we can identify, we read stories such as Anne Frank, and we feel sorry for her, and we think we probably would have been some of those Germans that would have hid the Jews and helped them out. Maybe. But what many times we do not understand, we also have the capacity to be that middle-aged German who was not able to fight on the front lines. So they told him, "Why don't you become a guard at these camps?" And because you wanted to serve your country, because you wanted to be patriotic, you said, "Count me in." But after months, they started to execute people at these camps. And they told you, they said, "If you can't stomach this, you don't have to do this. We can assign you to something else." But you wanted to be patriotic, and all of the people that you were there with, they stayed, and so you stayed also. And over time, it was not that hard to herd people into chambers and listen to their screams as the gas poured out. And then you could even help haul the corpses out on the other side. And then you got to a point to where you could actually take a Luger and walk up behind a 5-year-old girl and put a bullet in her brain. And then put one in the brain of her brother, and then their mother, and then their father. Until you understand that you have the capacity for all of that. Until you understand that in the right circumstances, in the right situation, given enough time, you have that darkness within you. You will never really understand mercy. You will never understand grace. And you will never understand forgiveness.